welcome to the Mind Cut series. We're diving into a question that's, well, as old as humanity itself. Why are we so driven to explore? And what does that fundamental urge actually mean for us today? Living in a world where you can just pull up a map of almost anywhere on your phone, our sources have us looking at the roots of this curiosity, the pull of the new, and how we try to balance that need for exploration with, well, the comfort of routine.
Exactly. And we'll be looking at this through, let's say, two main lenses. First, there's the deep-seated human drive thinking about evolutionary forces, maybe even genetic factors that might be at play there. And second, the really practical side, how understanding this drive can impact our daily lives. Influencing everything from how we learn and build habits to, frankly, our overall sense of well-being.
Right.
Our goal isn't just to, throw information at you. It's to extract some genuinely useful insights that help you understand your own exploratory nature and how to maybe harness it without feeling overwhelmed by it all.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. What is it that fuels this fundamental urge to explore?
Well, the material points to two big reasons, and they make a lot of sense when you think about it. One is that exploration is often useful, it's utilitarian. Think about our ancestors discovering a better hunting ground or maybe a safer place to live. That has clear benefits.
Sure, practical stuff.
But the other reason is more intrinsic. It just feels good sometimes, doesn't it? That itch to see what's around the next corner.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that feeling.
And what's really fascinating is how those two are connected. That feeling of reward we get from exploring. It likely evolved precisely because it was so useful for survival. It's not just about finding something good. It's the brain essentially saying, hey, pay attention to that unexpected new thing. That might be important.
Okay, let's unpack that feeling good part a bit more. Our sources talk about dopamine. Now, I know dopamine gets mentioned a lot with pleasure, but what's its specific role here in exploration?
Right, it's often simplified. Think of dopamine in this context as the, wow, that was surprisingly awesome signal in your brain. It's not just released when something positive happens, but it spikes even more when the outcome is better than you expected.
Ah, okay, the surprise factor.
Exactly. That prediction error, the gap between what you thought would happen and what actually did, that's a huge driver of exploratory behavior. If you venture into the unknown and find something unexpectedly great, that dopamine surge reinforces the urge to explore again. It teaches you that exploring can lead to better than anticipated results.
Ah, that makes so much sense. So it's not just the reward, but the unexpectedness of it that really grabs our attention and motivates us. But the sources also touched on how the same mechanism could be, well, a double-edged sword, right?
Right.
Potentially linked to things like addiction. How does that work?
That's a really crucial point. That initial dopamine rush you get from something novel, a new experience, or something else entirely, it can be incredibly powerful. But with repeated exposure, our expectations start to adjust. The novelty wears off.
Right, it's not surprising anymore.
Precisely. And the dopamine response diminishes. So to recapture that initial high, there's a temptation to seek out even more novelty or maybe increase the intensity. And that path can sometimes lead towards risky behaviors or addiction. So while this dopamine-driven exploration is absolutely vital for learning and growth, it's a powerful force we need to be, well, aware of.
Okay. Now, shifting gears just a little, our sources delve into the genetics of exploration. There's mention of a specific gene, the DRD4 gene. What's the story there?
Yeah, the DRD4 gene. What's fascinating is that certain variations of this gene, which influences how sensitive our dopamine receptors are, seem to be found more frequently in populations with a history of long-distance migration.
Really? Like people who moved around a lot historically?
Exactly. For example, some studies show a higher prevalence of these, let's call them explorer variants, in populations that migrated further from our origins in Africa. Think of it like this. Our genes might give us a kind of tendency or predisposition towards exploration, but it's our environment and our choices that ultimately shape how that plays out.
That's a really important distinction. So it's not destiny, but maybe more of an inclination.
Mm-hmm.
The numbers cited in the material were quite striking. I think it mentioned a much higher percentage in some South American populations compared to, say, some European ones. What does that tell us?
Well, it suggests a potential evolutionary advantage for these gene variants in those migratory contexts. In situations where moving and seeking new resources was critical, having a stronger drive to explore new territories could have been really beneficial. But, and this is crucial, everyone has the DRD4 gene. We just have different variations leading to different levels of sensitivity to novelty. And this variation within populations likely reflects something called frequency-dependent selection.
Frequency-dependent selection. Okay, that sounds a bit technical. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Think of it like roles within a team, or maybe an early human group. You need both the adventurous types, the scouts who go out exploring, and you need the reliable builders, the ones who consolidate and make things stable. If everyone was a scout, always moving on, who would build the village or tend the crops?
Right, nothing would get established.
And if everyone was a builder, content with the status quo, who would find new resources or better locations when needed? So in early human societies, having a mix of individuals, some more inclined to explore, others more inclined to consolidate knowledge and establish stable communities, that balance would have been most advantageous for the group's survival as a whole.
That makes perfect sense. The balance is key. Okay, so fast forward to today. We're not, constantly migrating across continents for the most part. How does this innate drive to explore, maybe influenced by our genes, actually play out in our modern world, which is, let's face it, largely mapped and structured?
That's a really interesting question, and it raises a potential challenge. The sources suggest that a strong exploratory drive, which might have been incredibly valuable for, say, our hunter-gatherer ancestors, can sometimes feel like a bit of a mismatch in our highly structured modern environments.
Like it doesn't quite fit anymore.
Sometimes, yeah. Think about a child with a really strong inclination towards novelty, that exploratory urge. They might struggle to sit still and focus in a traditional classroom setting. That same curiosity that might have driven them to discover new plants or animal tracks could easily be perceived as restlessness or distractibility in a more rigid environment.
I can see that. That inherent desire for the new could feel more like a distraction than an advantage in certain contexts today. But even though we're not discovering new continents on foot, surely the spirit of exploration doesn't just vanish, right?
Not at all. Not at all. The key insight here, I think, is that the domain of exploration can shift. Even if the physical world is largely charted, Google Maps exists, there are still vast uncharted territories elsewhere. Well, within the realms of ideas, personal growth, creative expression, even just understanding our own minds and cognitive landscapes, we can still be explorers in countless ways, just maybe not always with a backpack and compass.
Speaking of our cognitive landscapes, the sources draw a really fascinating parallel between physical exploration and how our brains actually work.
Oh.
They specifically mentioned the hippocampus. What's the connection there?
This is really quite remarkable. Just like we create mental maps when we navigate a new city, our hippocampus, which is a key brain region for memory and spatial navigation, it also seems to map out relationships between ideas, concepts, even people within our social networks.
So it's mapping more than just streets.
Absolutely. The famous study of London taxi drivers is a great example, because they have to learn the knowledge, this incredibly complex map of London streets. They actually develop demonstrably larger hippocampi. It physically changes their brain structure.
Yeah.
It strongly suggests that engaging in that kind of intense spatial exploration actively builds up that part of the brain.
So it's not just about remembering left turns and roundabouts. Our brains are literally building maps of concepts and connections, too.
Exactly. The hippocampus is crucial for forming these cognitive maps. It helps us understand how different pieces of information relate to each other, how ideas connect, and even how we fit into our social world. So activities like learning a new skill, diving deep into a complex topic, even figuring out social dynamics, these are all forms of cognitive exploration that engage these same neural structures.
And there are broader benefits, too, right?
Yeah.
Beyond just learning stuff.
Yes, definitely. This isn't just about, remembering where you parked your car, although that's useful. The hippocampus is really crucial for overall cognitive health and resilience. Some studies suggest that keeping the hippocampus active and engaged, maybe through various forms of exploration, might play a protective role against age-related cognitive decline. It might even contribute to better emotional regulation.
Okay, this fascinating link between physical and cognitive mapping really sets the stage for a fundamental challenge we all face, which you touched on earlier. It's this tension between how much we should stick to what we know versus venturing out into the unknown. The sources call this the explore-exploit dilemma. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. At its core, the explore-exploit dilemma is about finding the right balance. It's balancing the potential rewards of trying new things, that's the explore part, with the certainty and efficiency of sticking to what's already known and reliable, the exploit part.
Give me an example.
Okay. Think about your favorite coffee shop. You know they make a decent latte. You could go there every day that's exploiting your knowledge. Or you could try that new place that just opened down the street.
Right, hoping it might be even better.
Exactly. That's exploring. You risk getting a bad coffee, but you also have the chance of discovering an amazing new favorite spot. It's that trade-off.
I definitely recognize that tension in my own life. It's that pull between the comfort of the familiar and the tantalizing possibility of something even better. The sources mention how our music taste tends to narrow as we get older, as an example of leaning more towards exploitation.
Yeah, that's a classic example. We find genres or artists we like, things we know give us pleasure, and it just becomes easier and more efficient to stick with that. And look, there's nothing inherently wrong with enjoying familiar pleasures. Exploitation is efficient. But constantly defaulting to exploitation without any exploration can lead to missed opportunities. It can make our experience of the world a bit less rich, maybe a bit stagnant.
But the opposite is also true, right? Just constantly exploring.
Absolutely. Constantly chasing the next new thing without ever taking the time to really appreciate and integrate what you've found. That can also be counterproductive. You never actually enjoy the fruits of your exploration. Life isn't just about finding the single best path and sticking to it rigidly. Sometimes, veering off that path, even if it seems less efficient initially, can lead to surprisingly richer experiences.
Okay, so how do we navigate this trade-off more effectively? Are there any, mental tools or strategies we can actually use day to day?
The sources offer a few really useful ideas. One is this concept of giving yourself an uncertainty bonus.
An uncertainty bonus, what's that?
Essentially, when you're faced with the decision between something familiar and something unknown, you consciously give a little extra mental weight to the option you know less about. It's like a deliberate mental nudge to counteract our natural tendency to just default to the comfortable, known choice. It helps tip the scale slightly towards exploration.
Ah, okay, so you're intentionally valuing the unknown a bit more just because it is unknown. The material also mentions something called the upper confidence bound algorithm. That sounds pretty technical. What's the practical takeaway there?
Yeah, that sounds more complex than the core idea. The practical translation is basically optimism in the face of uncertainty. When you're weighing different options, especially the ones you haven't tried before, try to consider the most optimistic, realistic outcome for each. The idea is that being deliberately a little optimistic about those unexplored paths can actually lead to better long-term results. It encourages you to take calculated risks.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine you have a stable job, but you get an offer for a less stable role that seems much closer to your dream job. The exploit option is sticking with stability. The optimistic exploration approach involves really considering the best plausible case for that new job. Maybe it takes off, maybe it leads to amazing opportunities, and weighing that potential upside against the certainty of your current role. It helps you not be overly cautious.
Okay, so it's about not just focusing on the potential downsides of the unknown, but actively considering the potential upsides, too. That seems to tie into the idea of regret minimization that was also discussed.
Exactly. Regret in this decision-making context is that feeling you get looking back, the difference between the outcome you actually experienced and the best possible outcome you could have had if you'd chosen differently. Now, since we can't predict the future perfectly, some regret is pretty much inevitable, right?
Sure, you can't always know.
But by adopting this mindset of optimistic exploration, by consciously giving uncertain options a bit more weight, we're proactively taking chances that might lead to better outcomes. And over the long run, that strategy tends to reduce the likelihood of those big future what-ifs.
So uncertainty itself seems absolutely central to this whole idea of exploration. Why is embracing the unknown, even though it can feel uncomfortable, so important?
Well, uncertainty is basically the fertile ground where learning happens. We are naturally, intrinsically drawn to situations where the outcome isn't guaranteed. Why? Because those are the situations with the highest potential for gaining new information, for finding something unexpected, for exceeding our expectations. It's the spark that really ignites our curiosity.
But isn't there a limit? Too much uncertainty can just be chaos, right? It can be paralyzing.
Yeah.
The sources mention something called the Wundt curve. Or wait, is it the Wundt curve?
Yeah.
UUUNBT.
Yes, the Wundt curve, exactly. And you're right, it describes this kind of sweet spot of uncertainty or novelty. Too little uncertainty is boring, predictable, we tune out. Too much uncertainty feels chaotic, overwhelming, maybe even threatening.
So we like it just right.
Precisely. We are most engaged, most interested, when there's just enough novelty to pique our curiosity, but still within a framework where we feel we can understand or potentially master the situation. Think about a baby's preference for toys. They're often not interested in something completely predictable, like a plain block maybe, or something utterly random and nonsensical. They like toys that offer a bit of novelty within a familiar structure, something that squeaks unexpectedly or has a new texture.
That makes perfect sense. It applies to music too, right? We like songs that have familiar structures, but maybe an unexpected chord change or rhythm.
Exactly. Too predictable is boring. Completely random noise is unpleasant. We like that balance. And that example in the material about infants being able to distinguish between individual sheep faces was also really interesting in this context.
Yeah, what was the point there?
It highlights how incredibly attuned we are to subtle differences early in life. That sensitivity is a key skill for navigating uncertainty and learning rapidly about the world. But sources suggest, as we get older, our brains become more efficient. We start categorizing, generalizing.
We lump things together more.
Kind of, yes. We might lose some of that fine-grained sensitivity to novelty, that ability to perceive subtle differences that was so strong in infancy. It's almost as if our drive for efficiency and optimization can sometimes, unintentionally, dampen our intrinsic motivation to explore the subtle variations in things around us.
This tension between efficiency and maybe serendipity feels so relevant to daily life. Think about commuting. Most of us find the fastest, most predictable route and just stick to it religiously. We eliminate the uncertainty.
Exactly. And while that's super efficient, it also closes us off to possibilities. You won't discover a more scenic route that way, or a quicker shortcut that only works sometimes, or even just stumble upon a great new coffee shop or park along the way. The example they gave of the London Underground strike was perfect. For some people, that massive disruption forced them to explore new routes, and some actually discovered ways to commute that were better than their old routine.
Right. The forced exploration led to an unexpected benefit.
Sometimes those disruptions to our optimized routines, however annoying at the time, can shake things up in a good way.
Okay, but let's be honest. Exploration often requires effort, doesn't it? Venturing into the unknown isn't always easy, and the initial results might even be worse than sticking with the familiar. The sources touched on something called the effort paradox. What's the core idea there?
Yeah, the effort paradox is this really fascinating psychological phenomenon. It's the idea that the more effort we invest in something, the more we tend to value it in the end. Think about running a marathon. It's incredibly hard work, right? Or learning a difficult musical instrument, or even just assembling some complicated flat-pack furniture. Despite the struggle, maybe because of the struggle, the effort involved somehow increases our sense of accomplishment and our attachment to the outcome. The IKEA effect is a perfect, everyday example of this.
Right. That wobbly bookshelf you spent hours cursing at suddenly feels like a masterpiece, like your prized possession.
Precisely. The effort itself becomes intertwined with the value. It can become a source of meaning and satisfaction, so it reframes the challenge. It's not just an obstacle to get past, but the effort itself contributes to the reward.
And this willingness to embrace effort connects to resilience, too.
Absolutely. When we consistently engage with things that require effort, when we push through challenges, we build mental toughness, we learn we can handle difficulty. So when bigger setbacks inevitably come along in life, we're better equipped to face them, drawing on that experience of overcoming effortful tasks. Think about the inner monologue of an endurance athlete pushing through pain that's learned resilience through effort.
So it's about seeing effort, not just as a cost, but as a potential investment in meaning and resilience. Now, shifting slightly, one potential pitfall of being constantly focused on exploring and seeking future rewards is the risk of kind of missing out on the present moment. The sources call this instrumental living. Can you elaborate on that danger?
Yeah, this is a really important check or balance to consider. If our entire focus is always on what exploration might bring us in the future, the next goal, the next discovery, the next achievement, we risk neglecting the enjoyment and the value of the here and now. That explore-exploit dilemma we talked about, it doesn't just apply to choices about what to do next, but also to how we engage with our experiences.
So we need to exploit the present moment sometimes, too.
In a manner of speaking, yes. We need to find a balance between seeking out new experiences and fully savoring, fully exploiting the richness of the ones we're currently having. Otherwise, life becomes just a series of stepping stones to a future that never quite arrives.
It's like constantly planning the perfect vacation, but never actually relaxing and enjoying the beach when you get there. Okay, so bringing this all together now, what are some practical ways we can actually apply these insights about exploration in our own lives? I know you mentioned earlier, as a personal example, making a conscious effort sometimes to avoid relying solely on GPS navigation. Can you tell us a bit more about the why behind that choice?
Yes, sure. That's just a small personal example of trying to consciously inject a bit more cognitive exploration into a routine task. The thinking there goes right back to the hippocampus, its role in spatial navigation and building those cognitive maps we discussed. By deliberately trying to navigate without constant turn-by-turn directions, even in familiar areas sometimes, I'm actively engaging my hippocampus, forcing it to work a bit harder to create and update those mental maps.
So you're giving your hippocampus a workout.
Kinda, yeah. And there's some research still evolving, mind you, suggesting that keeping the hippocampus actively engaged might be beneficial for overall cognitive health long term. Some studies hint at potential roles in mitigating risks associated with, say, smaller hippocampal volume later in life, which can be linked to conditions like Alzheimer's, PTSD, or depression. But again, it's important to have caveats. A direct causal link specifically to GPS usage isn't definitively established. It's more about the principle of engaging that spatial mapping system. Plus, my kids find it endlessly amusing when I occasionally take a wrong turn and get us slightly lost. Builds character, right?
Yeah. A little adventure. Okay, that's a fascinating practical application.
Yeah.
Now, what advice would you offer to someone listening who maybe recognizes the value of exploration intellectually, but naturally leans towards certainty? Someone who finds uncertainty genuinely a bit uncomfortable or stressful?
That's a great question. The key, I think, is to start small and find your own Wundt curve for uncertainty, your own sweet spot. You absolutely don't need to suddenly become some extreme risk-taking adventurer. Maybe just ask yourself, are there any areas in your daily routine where you consistently, almost automatically, choose the most predictable option? Like always ordering the exact same dish at your favorite restaurant, or always taking the precise same route to work down to the street, or always listening to the same music playlist. Consider introducing just small acts of exploration in those specific low-stakes areas. Try that other dish on the menu just once. Take a slightly different parallel street on your commute tomorrow. Listen to a recommended for your playlist you'd normally ignore.
So baby steps into the unknown.
Exactly. The goal isn't to completely overhaul your life or induce anxiety. It's just to gently nudge yourself outside your absolute comfort zone occasionally and see what happens. See what you might discover. Even people who are highly optimized and genuinely prefer routine can often benefit from the occasional surprise, the new perspective, or just the simple learning that comes from encountering something slightly unexpected.
Okay. So to kind of bring our deep dive to a close here, what are the core takeaways we should leave listeners with about this fundamental human drive to explore?
Well, I think the main thing is that this urge to explore is truly a deep-seated part of what makes us human. It's fundamental. It seems to be driven by this interplay between practical utilitarian needs, finding better resources, learning useful things, and also the intrinsic reward of novelty itself, that dopamine kick from the unexpected. And while the physical world might seem largely explored on the surface today, the need for exploration in our cognitive lives, our personal growth, our creativity, that remains just as vital as ever, maybe even more so. It's crucial for growth, for learning, and maybe even for maintaining brain health over the long run.
Right. And for you, the listener, we really encourage you to take a moment, maybe after this, just to reflect on your own balance. Where do you fall on that explore-exploit spectrum in different areas of your life? And maybe consider one small way, really small is fine, that you might introduce just a little bit more uncertainty or novelty into your week ahead. It could be as simple as trying a new recipe, like you said, or listening to a completely different genre of music you've never explored, or maybe even striking up a brief conversation with a neighbor or colleague you don't usually talk to.
Mm-hmm. And finally, perhaps a provocative thought to leave you with, something to mull over. In a world that seems increasingly optimized for efficiency, for predictability, for smoothing out all the bumps, what unexpected discoveries, what personal insights, what moments of genuine serendipity might we be missing out on by sticking so rigidly to our well-trodden paths?